How many times have you wanted to make a change, but you don't? You hesitate because the timing isn't right. You don't have all the tools you need. Things aren't perfect. You don't have all the questions answered. Yeah, that many times. So instead, you have Inaction. And in this conversation with Lindsay Lyons, you're going to find out that Inaction, especially for just causes, is even more harmful than going and starting with what you have and where you are. Hey, all you Seeing to Lead listeners, Dr. Chris Jones here with another episode of Seeing to Lead, and you are going to love listening to Lindsay Lyons talk to us about all things educational justice. You see, Lindsay's an educational justice coach. She helps schools and districts create feminist, anti-racist curricula that challenges, affirms, and inspires all students. The conversation we have, though, doesn't just deal with that, although that's an underlying piece of all of it. The conversation we're having is about learning and how learning in schools needs to move away from just being performance-based. That's right, talking about grades and so forth. We need to move from being, an old saying here, a sage on a stage, to making content relevant to unlock students' natural curiosity and passion for learning, because student voice is where it's at. If we want to truly create educational equity, we have to amplify student voice. We want our students to be able to take their learning outside of the classroom. It has to be moving towards understanding and meaningfulness. If we're going to do that, there needs to be a stronger and ongoing connection with not just the students, but parents as well, because it's all about being a community. We have to stop worrying about being perfect and pausing as we move to make these super important changes. And if we work with students to teach them that action through choices allows us to move forward without being perfect, well, then we've pretty much done our job. Look, I could go all day about these good things that we heard from Lindsay, but why don't we do what I like to do best? By getting started at getting better by listening to Lindsay Lyons herself on Seeing to Lead.
If we think about by not doing anything, often we are creating more harm, and we have to ask people in order to do that, right? We have to have this constant stream of information from students and getting to the student experience to really understand that. But if we think about the harm of inaction, it kind of reframes in our brain for us what that action step should be, or should we do something? Should we wait for perfection? I also think that idea of moving forward collectively and with student voice sometimes is a bit more palatable for people, because you can create the container for activism or civics education, if it's civics engagement, whatever you want to call it, so that students can choose the topic they're most interested in.
Dr. Chris Jones here, and welcome to Seeing to Lead, a show designed to help leaders increase their ability to effectively support, engage, and empower their staff through intentional practices so that they create an environment where everyone reaches their greatest level of success. On Seeing to Lead, communication rules the day as we hear voices from both teachers and leaders in an effort to examine perspectives, highlight misunderstandings, and provide steps to ultimately bridge the gap between what teachers need and provide through thoughtful dialogue. This show is about amplifying voices, creating understanding, and providing information to help everyone continually improve. I want to personally thank you for taking the time. Now, let's get to getting better.
Lindsay Lyons is an educational justice coach who helps schools and districts co-create feminist, anti-racist curricula that challenges, affirms, and inspires all students. A former New York City public school teacher, she holds a PhD in leadership and change and is the founder of the blog and podcast Time for Teachership. She believes the secret sauce of educational equity is student voice. I'm really happy that I was able to make this connection with Lindsay and have her on the podcast today, because the idea that she's an educational justice coach really piques my curiosity, but I love the idea that she believes in rocking the boat by challenging, affirming, and inspiring all students. Those are three very powerful words. So, Lindsay, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for coming on today.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
So I mentioned rocking the boat, and I'm part of a group, Daniel Bauer's mastermind, and we're all known as ruckus makers because we like to make a ruckus in education. You know, I've never heard of the title educational justice coach before. So do me a favor, fill the listeners in on, okay, so first, what is it? Second, how do you become that? And third, why did you become that?
Yes. Oh my gosh, what a great question. And I have received that question so many times since I just basically created that title for myself. So that is a title that is a result of being my own boss, so to speak. And so I was trying to think about, what is it that I do? An educational consultant just did not have the same ring to it. So coach, I actually used to be an athletic coach in the coach terms of the words. I coached boys varsity basketball in the Bronx, which is a really interesting thing for a white woman from upstate New York to do. But turn the team around. We went from a 1 win the season before I hopped on to a 50-50. So that was a really good shift. But so I think about that coaching experience from an athletics standpoint, and I was an athlete my whole life. And I think about, instructional coaching as well, being at the heart of what I do. Really trying to have growth at the center of everything. Teacher growth, student growth, personal and professional growth. We're all growing. And I think in the realm of justice and educational justice, it's so important to focus on that growth as opposed to perfection, because perfection, or the idea of striving toward perfection, or this dream thing that is exactly right and we never make mistakes, that is just something that limits us. And it often prevents us from taking any sort of action to advance justice. And so we just kind of are stuck in this muck of injustice. And so for me, justice is intersectional. My background and my degree in undergrad was gender and women's studies. So it's this intersectional feminism that's at the core, this anti-racism that's at the core of all that I do. I taught emerging multilingual students in New York City. And my degree in education is actually in special education. So thinking about students with IEPs, so it's disability justice, it's multilingual justice and literacy justice. And thinking about all of those pieces and all of the students in our spaces and all of the teacher identities that we hold, right? How do we advance a better world? And often we talk about advancing a better world for students are going to become these great leaders. And I think about how do we help them be leaders now, right? In a way that's immediately applicable to our communities. So that's a little bit of a roundabout definition, but that's what I would say I do. And I became it honestly from testing things out in my classroom as a teacher. And then my partner got a job out of state. So I was teaching in New York City. We moved to Massachusetts. And I said, I need a couple extra certifications to teach there. Let me just not do that. It will become a full-time coach and run my own business.
That's awesome. You said a couple things that I just want to throw a couple phrases out and get your reaction to from your explanation there. First of all, awesome that you were a boys basketball coach, jumped right into that. That's fantastic. When you're talking about coaching, what if I were to say to you, and what's your reaction to teaching is coaching?
Oh my God, yes, 100%. I would agree with that, because I think when I acted as kind of, the sage on the stage is the common phrase, but the way that we typically are taught in teacher school, or that I was taught, even in a quote unquote progressive program, I was still taught, here are the things you're going to teach them. They're going to learn it and they're going to spit it back at you. And I think about all the things, as a parent of an almost 1-year-old now, I see how kids' brains work. And I'm like, this is fascinating. Just how they learn, the creativity, the figuring out of patterns without me having to show them that. Just so many amazing things. And so for me, it's really thinking about how do I guide them to find what works for them, and how to kind of remix all of the things that we're learning into something that's immediately relevant, pulls in their interests, pulls in their strengths, because we're often very deficit focused, but wow, this kid can make a documentary. So how do they make a documentary that actually informs someone about this justice issue that I could never have thought of on my own? That's what's so exciting about school. And so that's what I think, in terms of the coaching space, I am better as a coach than kind of someone talking at students.
I'm so glad you said that. And the part you mentioned about deficit thinking, that's such a massive issue across education, actually across a lot of industries, not just to single out education. One of the things I thought of when you talked about coaching and getting people to progress, and the idea that they have the ability to do that, is I was lucky enough to be a participant in a Marine Educators Workshop down in Paris Island, where we went down and we basically went through the basic training aspects of Marines, which very interesting. I mean, there's a tons of stories. That's for another show. But we got to ask questions anyways. We do a couple of things and we got to ask questions. And one of the things the Marines said was a misconception about their branch of the military is that everybody just needs to mindlessly do what they're supposed to do. And they said that's different than what they actually teach, where yes, it appears that way because everybody has the same vision and goal. But what they do is they gradually, the drill instructors, and we got to see this in action, gradually pull away from control over the recruits so that they make decisions on their own in a team-based environment, because their thought is if they're in a very dangerous, oftentimes deadly situation, and something happens to the leader, which is likely to happen, that anybody can step forward and take the lead because they've been trained in that way and that they weren't pushed down to where they just take direction. All I can think of is that, isn't that the key to learning and understanding, where the person that's doing the teaching gradually steps back and gives control over that to those other individuals?
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think about like learning in school settings is often very performative. And I am not exempt from that. I was the kid who was like, if I don't get the straight A's, and I just put all of that pressure on myself, no one was making me do that. Although I do come from educator parents, so I'm sure that was societally.
Yeah. They pushed on you a little bit.
Absolutely. But I think it's so performative that we're doing things for a grade, which is why I think we really want to coach and co-create projects that are expanding beyond the classroom. What is the purpose beyond the grade? And if we can't answer an assessment's purpose beyond the grade or an audience beyond the teacher, then it's not good enough in my mind, right? That's part of it. We want students to be able to take that learning process outside of the classroom, it's not just preparing them for college, right? It's preparing them for life. It's preparing them for Saturday when they went to the grocery store and something happened, or they had to calculate this thing, or, life, right? Whatever life looks like. And I just think that is such a powerful kind of analogy that you read in our story that you shared, because I think that's the gem, right? That's the dream, is that we're preparing students for life today, not tomorrow. And I think about that in terms of subs. I would be able to have subs in my class and not really leave a lot of lesson plans, which I just saw a tweet today as someone was never underestimate how long it takes to prep sub plans. And I used to say, absolutely. Once I shifted to project-based learning and students being able to kind of learn on their own without me there, I am a coach. I don't even need to always be present. I'm a coach that can kind of tap in and out, and students can, like you said in that example, kind of connect with their teammates, so to speak, or their classmates, figure it out on their own. And it's so much easier to take a mental health day, a personal day, a sick day, whatever, and let the kids go because they're motivated by the project they're working on because they co-created it, and they're equipped through the coaching to take on learning themselves.
So true what you're saying. And it's funny because when I go into classrooms, I love being in classrooms and just doing some quick walkthroughs, but I like talking to the students when I go into classrooms. And what I'll do is I'll go up to students and I have 3 questions. And it's funny, some of the students know, so they shy away from me sometimes a little bit. And I go in and I ask them, I say, so, okay, why are you learning what you're learning? What's the big deal about what you're learning? And so they'll kind of fumble through that a little bit and answer that. And then I'll ask them, I'll say, so how do you know when you understand it? And so then they'll answer that. And then this is sometimes what hurts my feelings. I'll say, so how does the teacher know when you understand it? And more often than not, I get a good grade. And I'm like, no, you were doing so well on the first 2 questions. But it's so true. This is not anything negative about teachers or anything like that, but it's so true. The system that we're so entwined in has to do with that grade. And even when we sit and talk about not doing grades or changing grades, then it becomes the big sell is the parents. The parents will never accept that. How do we tell kids what they're doing or how good they're doing if we don't have that letter grade that's arbitrary and subjective anyways to forward off to the colleges so then we can get all the accolades with the colleges? It's just such a vicious cycle.
Oh my gosh, yes. And I was at a school that transitioned to standards-based grading and competency-based education and all of that. And that was the huge piece, right? Was what will the parents think and what will the colleges think when we send these transcripts off? And so I think it is systemic in the sense that colleges also have to think about new ways. And honestly, I think AI, chat, GPT, all the things maybe are helping people rethink all of the things, right? Like assessment and like how we value like an applicant to a college. So I think all systemically that should change. But also I think that speaks to a lack of partnership with parents and the systems to support that for sure. I'm not putting this just on teachers, but like if we are partnering with parents, we have an ongoing communication. They always know how students are doing, right? If students are so excited about the class, they're talking about it at the dinner table or, early in the morning at breakfast or, wherever, because they're like, that's just part of natural conversation. And like, there's a fusion of kind of like home and school. And so I think that also speaks to that could be better.
Perfect. And all this conversation is a great segue to the second question I wanted to ask you from your very first opening salvo, so to speak here. Here's another phrase for you. I just want to get your reaction from it. Perfectionism freezes us. It's too big.
Yeah. I think so many teachers and leaders who I talk to about justice, like often one of the things I'll talk about is facilitating conversations with staff and students about racism, transphobia, current events, election politics, like all of the things that are like, ooh, we don't want to go there. And people will say, I want to, but I am nervous. I am fearful. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to. It often comes from such a good place. I don't want to increase harm. I worked with a history department to rework their curriculum. And one of the arguments for not kind of moving a little bit faster, putting it into place in the coming year, delaying it another 1 to 2 years was, well, we don't want to implement and do it in a harmful way. And my response was, well, the data you have shared with me from your students, particularly your Black students, have told you it is currently harming them. So, like if we think about like, by not doing anything, often we are creating more harm and we have to ask people in order to do that, right? We have to have this constant stream of information from students and getting to the student experience to really understand that. But if we think about the harm of inaction, it kind of reframes in our brain for us what that action step should be, or should we do something? Should we wait for perfection? I also think that idea of moving forward collectively and with student voice sometimes is a bit more palatable for people because you can create the container for activism or civics education, if it's civics engagement, whatever you want to call it, so that students can choose the topic they're most interested in. So that way, when a parent comes in, because often we make those decisions thinking about that parent, right? That one parent, often a white, very well-resourced parent, right? If that parent that we're thinking of, that could be a whole other podcast episode of like, why are we thinking of that one parent instead of all the other parents? But if we think about that parent coming in to have a conversation about, oh, why are you doing this project? Why are you talking about this topic with my student or my child? It is much easier to talk to them to say, well, your child has the option to study whatever issue they are passionate about. Like I am presenting them with the opportunity to make an impact in their community, to better the community. I think that's another piece too, like defining better for me. One of the foundational agreements to a class community, and we do these class community agreements, day one and come back to them over and over. For me, something that has to be part of that agreement list is that dignity can never be violated. So you can never violate another person's humanity or dignity, or a group of people's humanity or dignity. Like that's just like we don't cross that line. And that opens it up then to, within that container, any topic is on the table, right? And that is a much different conversation with a parent to say, your child chose this topic, or, something like that. Then I'm telling them they have to think this way, which is often the narrative about talking about things like this.
So and I'm glad you said narrative. That's such a fine line to walk, and an uncomfortable line to walk. I mean, we're asking people not to just get vulnerable, because that's difficult, but we're asking people to get vulnerable in a very real, visceral way that is tied up in a lot of history, possibly their own personal history that they've been affected by in their own personal lives, not just the society around them, but their own personal lives. And sometimes it's difficult to come to grips with that. So how do leaders need this too, but how do leaders help support teachers in classrooms navigate these conversations about race, gender, politics, current events, all of these things that you just said to me in a neutral way?
Oh my God, so many layers to that. First,
here we go.
I love this question.
Let's lean into what you're really good at.
So first thing, and I don't know that leaders are going to be happy with me for this answer, but the first thing I would say, the best way to have teachers practice the skills to do that work is as the leader to use staff meetings and other gatherings of teachers to have those conversations. Now that can be so tricky, right? Because people are like, oh, we're not going to be talking politics with our staff. Like, we're not going to open that can of worms. I know these 6, teachers voted for Trump, and these 6 are part of Black Lives Matter, or, whatever. Like, we have to be able to do this work as adults if we are ever going to get close to doing it with students. And so the number one thing I would do is kind of flex your own facilitation muscles and build those up as a leader and go there with staff. It is like life-changing, culture-changing, and it's going to take some work. It's not like a 60-minute staff meeting, but it is going to be transformational. And the things that they're going to learn there, oh my gosh, it will immediately transcend into their interactions with students. So there's so many things that I can say about, how that would work. I would say, one, you want to have those agreements. So just like you would with a class, we would want to co-create those agreements. We would want to have a format where everyone feels heard. So I like circle as a literal protocol, like talking piece, everyone has a chance to speak kind of thing. Everyone listens, as they're supposed to. But then I also think one of the things that's really been a shift for me in the past couple of years in doing this work is thinking about the emotion and actually naming emotion before anything else, before explaining, debating, discussing. So for example, a conversation might be, okay, so this just happened, like some news event, right? And you post a headline on the board or something. Everyone's going to take a moment with a talking piece, and you have the option to share or pass. Share one word that is an emotion word about how you are feeling in this moment. So now it's like, okay, everyone can connect to the emotion, right? Like everyone's like, oh, you're feeling fearful. Like, oh, I don't like feeling afraid either. Like that's something I can connect with you as a human. And thinking about that is a good one. Another one is thinking about underlying needs. So in a situation, right, like thinking about student-to-student conflict, teacher-to-teacher conflict, having that conflict in a discussion in a staff meeting about a current event, for example, what is the underlying need that's not being met? And if we can use the language of needs, it totally transforms the conversation. So this comes from restorative practices, but thinking about, I use the acronym BASE, which I think is an adaptation of Glaser's 5 basic needs. So B is belonging. Is there a lack of belonging? You don't feel accepted. You don't feel like you're valued. You don't feel you belong. Like that's hard. And if someone told me, wow, in a conversation about this, I feel a lack of belonging because I'm the only one who doesn't think this, I can at least empathize, there. Another one is autonomy, survival. Like if you're just trying to survive, you have your head down in my class as a student, like you didn't sleep last night because you worked 30 hours this week trying to help your parents pay rent. Like, whoa, I'm now very much empathetic. I'm not like, why is your head down in my class? Right. I'm just thinking about all these examples. And the fourth one, the E is enjoyment. So how do we bring joy into the experience of conversations, even when they're hard, right? How do we find moments of levity and connection and joy in the hard stuff, which is all obviously taking a lot of time to practice. But that's why I think the staff meetings are a wonderful opportunity.
Okay, so you heard it here first, listeners. Lindsay just laid out every leader's next year's worth of staff meetings. I think about this and I think about some of the vision of the graduate work that we're doing and how you build a statement that you own. And in faculty meetings, because, listeners, some of my listeners are going to have small faculties where they can do this and they could actually run it like a class almost. Other listeners, myself included, have larger faculties where it's not that easy to be able to do that. It's unwieldy at that size. So realistically, when we're talking about something like that, I'm envisioning being able to take the faculty and break the faculty into groups and do that side group work. I'm just being completely honest and open as a leader. My fear is that when I break the faculty into those groups, I can't be at every group at the same time. And I'm not a controlling person, but I feel like I'm losing control then. I feel like I'm going to miss out on something, or there's going to be something that goes on that I don't know about that may be a valuable piece of the puzzle. Is there a way to deal with something like that? Is there a way to build up to something like that? I have a high level of trust in my faculty, so maybe it's a nosy thing that I just have to get out of that. But
I think that's a very real concern. I mean, I think I could empathize very deeply with that, right? Even just thinking about facilitating, from a facilitator lens, right? I've never been the principal of school, but I have facilitated, like 100 participants, and now we're in breakout rooms or we're in different like spaces and having separate conversations. Like, what is it? What should they talk about? So I totally empathize, and I think there's a couple ways that you could do it. One is just exactly like that, what you said, break them up into different groups. And then I would have like a core team of volunteers who are kind of starting to already do this work in their classrooms, that they're kind of like willing to have these kind of conversations. They're part of these conversations with their families, with their peer groups, with their staff members that they're close to, whatever. And willing to kind of be a facilitator, I think in circle language is the keeper of the circle, and kind of report back some themes. So I would always take notes when my students were in circle. I wanted to make sure that I was, making eye contact and truly listening, but I would also take notes on the themes. And I would also take notes on like phrases that kind of like hit me in the gut. So that could be, I would often pose them in an academic sense as like, almost like a CNN fact checkers after a debate where it's like, was this true? And then honestly, like the next day we would have a class lesson of like, let's investigate if these were true, like let's take out our laptops. So I think there's kind of a degree of that. Like you want to make space for almost debriefing the discussion and kind of pull those themes together. So like staff meeting 1 is the conversation. Staff meeting 2 is actually going to be like, okay, so here's some things that came up because things are going to come up and we want to make sure there's space to actually address them. The other option, I think, is to do like a fishbowl, which would be like really big on the outer circle, but to just have the people who are willing to do this work be in the core. And obviously that's going to be really a different conversation than people who are being like voluntold to be in the center group, right? But it at least generates the start of a conversation. And I would be really careful, having been actually a participant in a space like that where I was told to be on the inside of the circle and other people were told to be on the inside of the circle. That kind of forced dynamic is not a good place to start with like I'm testing out this new thing. Like you really want people who are like, I am willing to do the emotional labor that is involved in this.
Right.
So I think that's a huge piece. Another option might be that you could break it up and say, so people who actually want to participate in a circle, we're going to do that with this group. There is kind of like a video series or something, or like we recorded this teacher's class or something, doing something similar. You're going to read an article about how to do this or something in this group. And so kind of like dividing it up by readiness. So you're going to read about it, you're going to maybe see it in action and reflect on it, and you're actually going to practice it. And then kind of have these kind of levels of engagement might be an idea.
Fantastic. And it's funny because just as you said video, I was thinking to myself, people give me a hard time about videos because I do videos each week. But I was thinking to myself, as you said that, what about a video of the people that are emotionally invested that you could share with staff? And the reason I say that is because, so when we wanted to do Mindful Minute, and as part of our SEL curriculum, we had some teachers that were willing to lead that charge. And so they would sit and do Mindful Minute exercises with students at the beginning of class. Other teachers didn't feel comfortable doing it. And you can't really do a mindful minute or lead a mindful minute if the students know that you're not buying what you're selling. So what we actually did is some of the teachers recorded their voice doing the mindful minute, gave that recording to the teacher, and then the teacher just hit play. Got the class ready, hit play. I'm almost wondering if for work like this, we could do something like that, where the teacher is emotionally invested. They could be the inner circle of the fishbowl, and then anybody that watched the video could be the fishbowl, but it wouldn't be that presence over their shoulder while they were involved in it.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love that idea. Another thing I was thinking that transcends the mindful minute example and the teacher staff example is having students lead. So mindful minute, for example, I did never feel super confident in my mindful minute ability, but I would like try it out. And then once students saw me do it a couple of times, I'm like, okay, who could do it better? And so like, I would just invite students to lead it. And they were just like, yeah, like this is so fun. I'm like, oh, great. Like I'm just enjoying like learning from you. And like, I think the same thing we have pulled in, when I used to be a teacher at my school, we actually would pull in students to PDs, totally changes the dynamic, totally changes it because they're like, oh, students are hearing me. Like I might not say this thing that would be actually really like offensive or mean or whatever, because like now I'm aware of like a person that it would directly impact. And like, it's terrible to think people are like harboring all those thoughts if students are not there or going to see them if they're not there. But like, I do think that idea of like, right. And we are doing this because of our students, because we want to improve the lives of our students. We are teachers to improve the lives of our students. Like, it's okay that students are part of these conversations. Now, I would caveat that by saying, like, if we do anticipate like some harmful things being said, that we don't throw students in there to like, experience that. But I do think like students are so capable of doing this work. And my high school students have for sure led circles on topics of racism, sexism, and all the things that are just important to them. And they've actually designed the circles and facilitated them. So that lens of saying, well, this student design circle, like we're actually just helping them achieve, from a teacher mind, sometimes that might be reluctant to do this. We're actually the audience for their assessment. This is their assessment for, this unit on sexism or whatever. Like they're going to come do this circle and we have to participate and give them feedback on it. Like that's another kind of entry point in. If you have a teacher who's like, I don't want to do this for myself, but I am passionate about student betterment and helping students.
That's awesome.
Supporting your teachers and students seems to be a struggle. They just don't seem to be engaged. You wish they would take more responsibility for their learning and culture of the building, but they just don't seem to be empowered enough to do it. So, my question is, have you checked out the book Seeing to Lead yet? It's all about creating a true educational experience where learning, growth, leadership, and community take center stage. Full of strategies and resources, Seeing to Lead is about attaining that goal by employing a model that supports, engages, and empowers all individuals to become leaders themselves. Pick up a copy today at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com. Remember, you don't become a leader and then decide you need to support and recognize others more than yourself. It is the moment you realize it's about supporting and recognizing others that you become a leader. seeingtolead.com.
Now, you mentioned all these things. One of the things I'm thinking about when you're having a circle or just from a student's everyday existence is a huge issue. But if I could just grab 30 seconds to a minute of your opinion, wall decorations, wall art, political statements on the walls, racist statements on the walls, the anti-racist statement on the walls. Where do we go with that outside of the social studies classroom? Because then it becomes a story that if you put one up and you have the opposing view, it's objective.
Ooh, 30 seconds. Okay.
All right, fine. I'll give you more time.
Okay, let me try to be very succinct. Yeah. One, I think wall decorations don't define a culture. A culture defines a culture. So that is a huge piece. I see sometimes people use wall decorations and they'll put up this beautiful statement of inclusion and it's not an inclusive space, right? So that's a piece, right? At the same time, I think you don't always need a counterpoint. So I think about, there's this beautiful quote, let me see if I can remember it here, by Jonathan Gold. And he talks about how it's, in contrast to the idea that we must hear all sides, right? This idea of like, we have to hear all the sides. Well, all the sides aren't really valuable if one side is just like denigrating an entire group of people and removing their human dignity. So he says, talking about perspectives without talking about power can imply an equivalency of viewpoints that brings with it a very real danger of erasing injustice. And that to me is like it, right? Like if we're trying to be justice-centered, if we want a justice-centered classroom, a sense of belonging for everyone, even students, honestly, like even in like 100% like homogeneous classrooms, we have like all like advantaged identities in there. And like, you're still part of like humanity, right? And Resmaa Menakem talks about this idea. Sorry, I'm going way above your 30 seconds here.
That's fine. There's a reason I said 30 seconds. We'll get to it after. Keep rolling. You're doing great.
So Resmaa Menakem talks about this idea of soul harm on white bodies in the context of white body supremacy. He calls it white body supremacy. And so he says there is a soul harm that happens to white people and white bodies as they participate uncritically in the system of white body supremacy. And so it actually harms people who are white, who are advantaged because of their whiteness, to not do anything to advance racial justice. And I think that is a wonderful entryway into like people who are saying, like, well, we here at my school or my district or whatever, we have 100% white population, which I don't even know if that place exists, but maybe, right? Like 100%, like it still applies, right? And it still is important to maintain human dignity and humanity for every group, regardless of who the students are in the classroom. And so I think to that point, like I'll speak to myself. I had political statements up in a non-history classroom. I had the, like all of the Women's March, all of the Black Lives Matter posters, like because that is what my students needed to see. And my students felt an increased sense of belonging. I hope from what I heard from the students who were willing to tell me about their perceptions of it, like it felt like an inclusive space and it felt like a space of hope and possibility when all they heard around them was the news that like everyone hates everyone and the world is falling apart and there's so much oppression. It's like we collectively can build this better world. Like it is possible and we will uphold people's humanity. I think that is a message and a hill that I'm willing to kind of like die on. So that's important.
Awesome. That's incredibly important. So the reason I asked you that for in a short period of time is because I wanted to prove a point. It's not black and white. People so want that right or wrong, black or white, and that's the answer. So either put the poster up or don't put the poster up. And what I'm hearing you say is it's not about the sign. We have to transcend the idea that it's about the sign. It's about the culture in the area, in the space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you can't we're recording this in February. So you can't like Black History Month poster your walls and then say like, we are all about racial justice in this class because we're doing Black History Month and it's on our walls. Like, nope, that's not the baseline. That is not justice.
Yeah. That's a great example because there are a lot of places that have all these Black History Month posters, programs, assemblies, and that's not quite the story.
Right. I would ask, are your Black students involved in making school policy? Like that might be more justice-y.
Right. So you did a lot of talking. You gave examples about leadership and staff meetings and in the classroom. You have a boot camp curriculum on your website, and I'm going to hook your website up in the show notes or link it up in the show notes. But you have a boot camp curriculum. Why don't you tell my listeners a little bit about that? Because I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to check out some of these things that you have to offer.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah. So Curriculum Bootcamp is kind of like my most favorite thing about education and working with teachers distilled into just a couple of days. So this is like all the things that bring joy and justice back into teaching that I think sometimes can feel like they're missing on a day-to-day basis. So basically, it is 2 days typically with a department where the teachers just get the freedom and creative space to just be with each other in co-creation and create a justice-centered unit. So it advances racial justice, gender justice, intersectional justice. Like that is at the core. We create a driving question that students are grappling with throughout the unit. And ultimately it ends in some sort of civic action. So students are actually using whatever they're learning. Doesn't matter the content area. This could be PE. This could be foreign language. This could be like math. I mean, some really cool ideas have come out of like math could be fantastically interesting if we let it be, right? And so we just create the outline of a unit all the way down to the lesson level in 2 days. And so I think this is also a response to, wow, we want to start from scratch, or wow, we realize there's so many gaps in our curriculum. And I always use the phrase add diversity and stir. You can't add diversity and stir your way into like a better curriculum, right? You need to like start from the ground up, and that terrifies people. So it's like, okay, if we can create a container where it happens in just 2 days, that now feels a lot more doable than this is going to be a 5-year process.
That's awesome. And, for anybody wondering about that, the idea of 2 days writing curriculum, because sometimes that seems daunting to people, like you said, especially if, hey, what do you mean? I have a curriculum. Why do I need to rewrite the whole thing instead of add stuff? Another piece about you that's really interesting that I wanted to mention that, well, I think if people check this out, they'll be more interested in your curriculum bootcamp. Talk to us about your podcast, because you have a podcast as well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So this kind of came out of a blog. And then I was like, I'm an echo chamber of myself and I want to like talk to other people. So I have learned so much from the amazing guests that are on the podcast, and Dr. Jones, I'm hoping will be a guest on the podcast too soon.
Oh, it was fine. Seeing you called me out of the air, I'll be on the podcast.
Amazing. I'm so excited. So we've had some really cool guests and some really cool series around curriculum planning, around school policy and students and school boards and things like this. Basically, it's the idea of how do we teach and lead for justice in school spaces? How do we amplify student voice in a meaningful way? And it's really, there's some how-to episodes that are about 20 minutes that are quick commute to work. You can just listen to that and have a practical, ready to go strategy. There's always a quick template that you can get as an episode freebie. And the guests they just bring the brilliance. So theirs are usually how have we led curriculum? Dr. Goldie Muhammad is going to be on the podcast soon. So that'll be an exciting one to listen to. Just how do you actually do this stuff? So I like to think of it as kind of my researcher brain is the theory, but then also the teacher brain is the practice. So how do we connect theory to practice?
So 3 things about that. First, I'm super excited about you asking me to be on the podcast. So yes, definitely.
Amazing.
Second, when you started mentioning your guests, that you just had a huge smile. Now, we're not videoing this, but you just got all excited about it. So you know that your heart is into it and you're passionate about it. And third, the big thing, resources, templates, and strategies.
Yes.
I mean, right there at your fingertips. So people definitely have to check that out. And why don't you let people know the title of it so they can search it wherever they listen?
Absolutely. It's Time for Teachership, which is actually a really interesting idea. I just came up with that off of the top of my head. And then I looked into it and I was like, oh, this is an actual academic construct where teachers are leaders and leaders are intimately involved in the day-to-day instruction of the classroom. So I love it.
See, you were ahead of the curve. Check you out. So we're getting near the end. You said a ton, but I do have 2 questions that I ask every guest on the show. The first one, if you were in the current position you are, because you're a teacher, now you're doing your own business, but you're still involved in it, in education. If you were not involved in education, who, not what would you be?
Such a hard question because my brain defaults to the what, but I think Matt Woods is the person who responded in this way, where he was talking about kind of it wouldn't be great. I think he said he'd be lost or something. And so those are all the things I could think about, right? I would probably be the what would probably be a justice advocate in some other realm, but the who would be I would be a frustrated individual. I think I get frustrated with adults sometimes. I love the energy and creativity and curiosity of kids. And so I would have a longing for that. And I would also, I think, be less patient. Kids have taught me a lot of patience. I still have a ways to go, but man, would I be less patient.
Yeah, that's excellent. That question, it's funny, the different answers that I get. I've had everything from people put 2 different people celebrities together as one person and say, this is who I'd be. I had another individual, I think it was Chris Dodge that did this. Really, he's a fantastic leader. He just recently went into the Worcester public school system, but he did it from a negative viewpoint. He sat down and looked at all the things that he had because of education. And then he said, he took those away, and what he had left is what he said, who he'd be.
Wow.
Yeah, it was, so this podcast, totally selfish. I learn things all the time from people. So just that whole thought process of looking at it from the other way.
You're totally sharing our podcasting secrets. This is why we got into podcasting, to learn from everybody else.
Yeah. Totally selfish. So the final question, and you've said so much today. And just in this short period of time that we've been together, you've given so many people so many things to think about and move forward with. What's the most important piece of advice you'd give to teachers and leaders as they work to better support, engage, and empower those they serve?
Yeah. So I think one is be adaptive in your leadership. So have an adaptive leadership kind of stance. The things that I think it's Heifetz, Grashow, and Linsky who talk about the habits, beliefs, and loyalties that underlie a problem, like an adaptive challenge, are really what we have to unearth and address. We so rarely address those. We tiptoe around them. We're afraid to make mistakes, as we talked about, right? All the things, and we don't get to them. And so we PD our way out of things, but we never actually get out of the things. So 5 years later, that strategic plan that we worked on, we're working on the same things, right? Because we don't address them as adaptive challenges. So I think that's huge. And then often I have a worksheet. Actually, we'll be able to, I think, link that in the show notes for you all, around Heifetz, Grashow, and Linsky's strategies for identifying, are you working with an adaptive challenge? So I think that's step one is it adaptive? But then step two is what do you actually do with that information, right? And I think so much of what I've talked about historically in the last, few years has been about like just identifying it as adaptive. But then what do you actually do? I think the answer is shared leadership. So this stuff can't be a top down, like this is the way forward. It has to be co-created. And I think we get close with things like distributive leadership. And I'm getting into theory a little bit here, but I think shared leadership is really different and unique to me because it is thinking about the students. It is thinking about the family members, the community members, like all of the stakeholders, not just the staff of a school. And that I think is truly where the richness happens. So as like a next step, Street Data is an amazing book that just came out, I think last year. Fantastic. They actually have a podcast now. Shane Saphir and Alcine Mumby started a podcast based on it called Street Data Pod. All sorts of ways to try to kind of learn from students about what their experience and perceptions of school are in a really kind of like non-quantitative, more qualitative way. That's just absolutely beautiful. And I think transformational for a school.
You just keep dropping resources. It's so just sorry. Like, no, you're apologizing for dropping resources. Like I'm pushing a button, go. That's fantastic. I'm definitely going to have to check that book out. And the podcast, Street Data Pod. Look, we're always interested if we're interested in doing what's best for students, we need to make sure we're getting information from students, what works best for them. Just like if we're trying to do what's best for teachers, we have to listen to them as well. So I just appreciate you so much for coming on the show and sharing all this knowledge and wisdom and, strategies and templates even. You shared that stuff too. So if people want to, I can't imagine that they want it after listening to you. If people want to, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think my website has a bunch of like additional free resources. So lindsaybethlyons.com is that. And it also links to the podcast, the blog, all the things. My email is on there as well. I think most social media platforms I'm not super active in. I am not a super big social media person, which is like a weird thing maybe for a millennial to say, but I am Lindsay Beth Lyons at most places. And Twitter, I think, is Lindsay B. Lyons.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Again, really, I appreciate it. You said some fantastic things, and I've learned so much from just listening to you for this time.
Wow, that means so much. Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Jones. This was amazing.
Well, that's a wrap, but not the end. Next step, be sure to take action on something you heard here today. Hey, thanks for listening to the Seeing to Lead podcast. If you would like to connect for any reason, email me at drchrissj@gmail.com or catch me on Twitter at Dr. C.S. Jones. If you've gotten any value from the Seeing to Lead podcast today, you can help me and other leaders create a world-class environment through a teacher-centric approach by subscribing to the show, leaving an honest rating and review, and sharing this episode on social media with your most valuable takeaway. Also, one last thing. Have you had a chance to pick up my latest 5-star rated book yet? Grab your copy of Seeing to Lead anywhere you buy books or at seeingtolead.com. That's seeingtolead.com, where you can learn more and continue to improve. Now go have a successful week.